You know Armin Shimerman as the scheming Ferengi Quark on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and possibly also as the principal of Sunnydale High on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But if you ask him what he considers to be his primary profession, you might be surprised by his answer. I'm primarily a teacher, he told me. Shimerman's also a writer, and the third book in his Illyria trilogy is set to be released early next year. He and I sat down to discuss the books, Shakespeare, Sherlock Holmes, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the late, great Rene Auberjonois. If you're considering buying the Illyria trilogy, I highly recommend starting with the first one, Betrayal of Angels, which you can order at Amazon. If you've already read the first two, you can pre-order the conclusion, Imbalance of Power, at the Jumpmaster Press website. All the links are in the show notes below. I'm T. Rick Jones, and this is your Daily Star Trek News. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. I loved reading your books. I read all three of them.
You couldn't have read all three of them. The third one hasn't come out yet.
They sent me a reader copy.
Oh, did they? Okay.
So yeah, I really enjoyed them. I am a Shakespeare nerd, as well as a Star Trek nerd and all kinds of other kind of nerdy
you and
things.
I must be brothers from long past then.
Yeah, I think we must be. So you consider yourself you're a television actor and you're a Shakespearean actor, but I read somewhere that you actually consider yourself more a teacher than anything. Is that right?
I am primarily a teacher. Certainly, I make my living from acting, and to some extent writing. But teaching is what I prefer, and if I had to give up everything else, I would hang on to the teaching and give the other things up. Yeah, the acting is wonderful, and it's a great opportunity to do things, and I'm very lucky in that profession. But it pales in comparison to the joy that I get from watching people understand what it is that I'm teaching. I teach primarily Shakespeare and to actors about how to make the language more understandable to an audience, which is relatively easy to do, easier than most people would think.
And you use that in your books, because your books are sort of have a leaning towards Elizabethan English
language. Yeah. Because I'm so steeped in it, I've done I think about a third of the canon. There are 37 plays altogether, and give or take. And I have done about a third of them. Some of them I've done more than once. In fact, last night I directed a production of a reading anyway of Richard II. So I deal with Shakespeare pretty much every day, and have been doing that since I went to college, which was not yesterday.
You know, professionally, I'm a stage manager, and I've done a lot of Shakespeare as well. I love Shakespeare, and actually, the last Shakespeare I did was Twelfth Night.
Well, yes, my books are all about Twelfth Night.
Yes.
Well, good for you. Stage managers are very important, and I look to them for help every time I get it. For me, the three most important people in the room is the director, the stage manager, and the dramaturge. The show wouldn't get done, and I was recently in a show where lots of things went wrong. It was actually the name of the play that goes wrong, but there were things going wrong that we hadn't rehearsed that were just happening because they were happening in live theater. And our stage manager was right on top of it, and we would have fallen apart many times had it not been for her quick thinking and knowledge.
For anybody who hasn't read the books yet, just give me a quick elevator pitch about what the trilogy is.
Well, the trilogy is both fantasy and history at the same time. I deal with the Elizabethan period, specifically the years of 1583 and 1584. I deal with the character who I've been fascinated with for many years. His name is John Dee, Dr. John Dee, who was an extraordinary Renaissance man at the time. He had the largest library in England. He was a great mathematician, a teacher to the king, to many important people of the court. He was a mystic, and sometimes we believe he was also a spy. So my novels have to deal with John Dee trying to find out the loyalty of a particular count on an island in the English Channel. And during the course, before he sets out on his investigation, he meets with a young playwright failure called Will Shakespeare. Will is about 16 years old and takes him on for this assignment, mainly because Shakespeare wants to learn from one of the greatest minds in England. And Dee wants to use Shakespeare because Shakespeare, in my books, and I believe perhaps in real life, had perhaps a photographic memory and certainly could remember lots of things. We know that it was a fact or factoid that in Elizabethan times, people had phenomenal memories, and they could listen to a sermon, come home and tell their aging grandparents who hadn't been able to make it to the sermon, word for word, what had been said during the church service. So it is the investigation of a particular count who was Catholic at that time. One of the great factions or debates or problems was a conflict between those people who believed in Protestantism and those people who ardently believed in Catholicism. There was great friction between those two beliefs. People were being killed off constantly because of their beliefs. And Dee is sent by the authorities to find out if a Catholic count in the English Channel is providing passageway for Catholics to invade England against the laws of the country at that time. And as we find out, I'm giving this away, but there you go. The count is Count Orsino from Twelfth Night, and a lot of the people that Dee and Shakespeare encounter on the island are the characters from Twelfth Night. But a great deal of the books are very much historical. Yes, they're fantastical because the Twelfth Night characters are there, but it is also historical because almost everything that I put into the novels is historically correct, including Dee's possibly being a spy. And we don't know what happened to Shakespeare in his early years. We don't know what happened between his time between Stratford and his first play, which is probably Henry VI, Part 2. So it's up for grabs where he was and how he became the scholar, poet, laureate that he was. And my premise is that he learned it from this great man, John Dee.
You said that people in that time seem to have better memories than we do today. What accounts for that, do you think?
I think because it was an oral culture and not a visual culture. I believe because a lot of people couldn't read and there were no movies to go to, no TV to go to, they depended upon what they heard to live, to survive. And so it became de rigueur to remember very well what happened. Your life depended upon it. It was a very dangerous time. The average life of a Londoner in 1583 was 22 years old. If you got to be 30, you were an old man. So you needed to remember things in order to survive.
The book trilogy is called Illyria. Illyria is a semi-fictional island in Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night. Why did you choose that setting? Why did you choose that play? There are other Easter eggs throughout of other plays, particularly like Hamlet. I've noticed a lot coming up. But Twelfth Night, why choose that as your backdrop?
Well, originally the idea was to write a series of novels based on these two main characters, Will and John Dee, investigating different crime scenes or ideas or missions, and each book would be related to a different play. The problem is it took me 20 years to complete these 3 novels, and so I started with Twelfth Night, mainly because I had been directing Twelfth Night at the time, and because I think Twelfth Night is one of Shakespeare's greatest plays. And those characters just seem to be right also for an investigation. So that's why I started with Twelfth Night, and if I had another 20 years, perhaps I could write about another play.
You've written about John Dee before. You co-wrote a series, right, about John Dee?
I co-wrote with 2 other authors a series called Merchant Prince. Michael Scott, who was my first co-writer in the first Merchant Prince book, is an Irish author, and he introduced me to John Dee. I didn't know about John Dee until Michael told me about him, and we set up this writing program between the two of us to write these Merchant Prince novels. And Michael and I wrote the first one together. I would say that I wrote about 40% of it. He wrote about 60% of it. And then we'll go into the long story. Michael and I, our partnership ended amicably, very amicably, but it ended. And so I was then teamed up with Chelsea Yarborough, a very famous science fiction writer, and we wrote the next one. In that case, I think I wrote about 70% of it. She wrote about 30% of it. And in the third one, I wrote 100% of it.
John Dee, as you say, was a real person. What about him makes him an interesting character for you to write about? What draws you to him?
Well, he's just fascinating. He's just, here was a man who is enormously knowledgeable. He was recognized as one of the smartest men in Europe at the time. He was also a poor man. The queen never kept her promises to him. He was a mystic. I find history has sort of shelved him with lunatics and crazies because he believed that he could communicate with angels, and why not? This was a period of time when a lot of the unthinkable things were happening. They were finding out, for instance, that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, but the sun was the center of the solar system. They were finding out about new lands in the Pacific and in the Americas. They were finding out about new scientific things. They were making huge discoveries. It doesn't seem that unlikely when everyone believed in the Bible, where angels definitely occupied, that angels didn't exist, and that some way there must be a way to communicate with those angels. And so it seemed like a reasonable, rational thing to do at the time. It may not seem so rational today. In hindsight, we think of him as slightly on the fringe, but the truth was he was following a scientific investigation as much as any other scientist at the time was doing. So I'm trying to brush up his reputation, although it doesn't need me to do that. In the last 75 years or so, I think people have been recognizing what a brilliant man he was and how important he was to Elizabethan England and to Jacobean England. And I just find him fascinating.
From John Dee to William Shakespeare, how did you, I mean, you've made a career out of William Shakespeare. How did you find him? What was the first play you read? What interests you about him?
Okay, now so we're going way back into my past, way back. I was born in New Jersey. That's how far back we're going. And then at 16, my family moved to California, where I entered a new high school in Santa Monica. And the English teacher saw that I was new to the high school and said, would you audition for a play? And he cast me in that, which was the lead in The Crucible. And then the next play was Hamlet in high school. And he cast me as Claudius the King in that. And I believe that's where my fascination with Shakespeare started, was in playing Claudius in Hamlet. When I graduated from high school, went on to school at UCLA, I originally started as a poli-sci major, but then quickly in my sophomore year, transferred over to the English department, worked with a specialization in Shakespeare. I had a phenomenal teacher named David Rhodes, and David was such a good teacher. And he so thrilled me about the study of Shakespeare that it became a passion of mine for the rest of my life. And I went on, as I said, to do many Shakespearean plays. My acting career started in a Shakespeare festival in San Diego, and I've been fascinated with all that time.
Does it give you a certain amount of freedom to write a novel? You get to be the director and all the actors of this story. Does that give you some freedom, or is it harder? What's your feeling on that?
That's an excellent question. I believe it gives me freedom because you're right. Not only do I get to play all the characters, but I also get to be the scene designer, the sound designer, the stage manager. I get to choose and pick what words I want to use. I'm fascinated by language. So that's a great, great freedom. But with that freedom comes a tremendous amount of hard work, especially when you're writing a historical novel, where if you want to be believed, if the story is going to be credible, you really have to do all the research possible to make sure that you don't have a telephone ringing, off to the side during a scene in the Elizabethan period. You have to make sure that, at least I have to make sure that everything is historically correct. And I've spent thousands of hours, hundreds of thousands of hours doing research to make sure everything that I wrote about is correct, except, I have one exception, except for the age of Shakespeare. In 1583, Will Shakespeare was a little bit older than 16, but only a couple of years. But I needed him to be that young for the story to work.
You set up John Dee and Shakespeare as sort of a Holmes and Watson. Did you consciously set out to make them that sort of team?
Yes, yes, yes. That was our original purpose. As Michael Scott, who, as I told you, co-wrote with me my first Merchant Prince book. He's actually the person who came up with the idea to have this Watson Holmes team investigate things from different plays. So as we discussed it over lunch, we came up with it together. Dee is the older, wiser man, the mentor, and Shakespeare is the mentee, trying to learn as much as he can. And the characters, as a stage manager, you know what I mean when I say backstory. So I've given all of these characters a tremendous amount of backstory before they actually show up in the actual play of Twelfth Night. So it was great fun as an actor, writer, to do that, to come up with backstories for all the characters in Twelfth Night, except for the two that arrive on the island at the beginning of the play.
Talk to me about Illyria for a second. Illyria was actually a real place, but
Yes.
not the way Shakespeare wrote
Yeah.
it. Shakespeare's was
Illyria, I believe, someone will probably correct me, but I believe Illyria, the original Illyria, was Turkey. That's where Illyria originally was. And then Shakespeare decided to put Illyria, one's not quite sure, but one would think it's in the Mediterranean. One gets the feeling that's where that is. It could be in the Bermudas, I don't know, but it's certainly not in the English Channel. But I needed to have it in the English Channel, and so I placed Illyria in the English Channel. And I based Illyria as far as descriptions and placement geography on the Isle of Jersey. I'm from New Jersey, so that seems like a good place to be.
Now, not to give too much away, but at the beginning of the second book, A Sea of Troubles, John Dee is called away to attend his own trial. Did that actually happen to him? Was that a real event?
He was put on trial, yes, not in that particular court. That court was the highest court in the land, and ironically, it really wasn't a court. It was a tribunal. It was a inquisition, basically. But John Dee was put on trial at least once for his religious ideas. He was hounded for his reputation as a necromancer, as a warlock. And you see, he's a fascinating guy. But he didn't appear in that particular court. But that court was so fascinating to me. And because I wanted him to be facing his accuser, which was also his employer, Francis Walsingham, I wanted to make that court. That's the only court where Walsingham would have sat. So it was important to do that. And that, as I was talking about research before, was months of research.
Yeah, and then that novel ends with a major cliffhanger that is resolved in the third
Right.
novel.
And why? The question has to be asked: why does Armin have two cliffhangers? And I'm again giving something away in the first and second book. And the reason is, I told you it took me 20 years to write this story, and it was all one story at one time. And when Jumpmaster Press bought the book, it's only after we signed the papers, they asked me, so how many words do you have? And when I told them that I had several hundreds of thousands of words, they said, you don't have one book, you have 3 books. So in order to make it 3 books, I called upon my past life as an actor in a television series and realized I need some cliffhangers here in order to extend the book, which prompted, we talked about the trial, which prompted me to have to take long tangent journeys around the original story in order to facilitate what had happened in the cliffhanger. And what happens in the second book, without giving too much away, is sort of what happens in the Sherlock Holmes stories as well. So, I know for the second and third book, I had to write an extra 100 pages in order to bring the story back to where it originally been.
Basically, Jumpmaster Press made you add to the book, which I think is a good thing.
It is a very good thing because what I added, I'm very, very happy with what I added. I'm very happy with what they sort of didn't force me to do, but urged me to do. And I think the story is better. I think the books are better because of that tangent being incorporated into the books.
Talk to me a little bit about Shakespeare's name, because it seems like he never signed his name the same way twice. Right. And in the novels, you call him Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. Spar is the end of that name. Why did you choose that? And then I think it's Diane starts nicknaming him Shakespeare. Right. Why?
He says, "Oh, I think I'd like to be called that." Yeah. So you pinpointed it. You've answered the question yourself, which is that we know that there are, I think I have this right, that there are 6 examples of Shakespeare's signature where he wrote his own name. In 3 of those examples, he spells it differently, because spelling was not what we think it is. There was no such thing as a spelling bee back then. You could spell a word any way you liked and nobody cared. It was up to the reader to figure out what it is that you meant. And depending on your accent, you spelled the word according to your accent. Shakespeare himself, as I said, wrote his last name different ways. And I decided to follow in that sort of theme and spell it a different way myself. I'm not so sure if I had it to do all over again that I wouldn't have spelt it a different way. Still wouldn't have spelt it the way that we normally see it, but I might have gone with Shax with an X, because I think that would have been a better choice. But I wanted to give lip service to the fact that Shakespeare never spelt his name the same way, so I didn't want the reader to see Shakespeare and assume that was the way he spelt it all the time. And you might think it's a typographical error. Why is that? And one of the great things that, if I may take a tangent on this, that a Shakespearean actor, director, and perhaps you face this in your own productions, is that we're never sure what were the exact words in the plays sometimes. For instance, the most famous of the inexactitudes. "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt." One version of the original text has solid. "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into the dew." And the other version is, "Oh, that this too," I've just forgotten the other word, "solid and sullied." So we Americans tend to use solid. That's our sort of go-to choice word. The Brits tend to use sullied, not solid. So we're never sure what words were the words that he actually wrote, or did he change it? You've been in enough productions to know if the playwright is sitting there, she can often change words in rehearsals and say, "Okay, don't like that so much, we're going to change it to this." And then the actors grumble because they have a new line to memorize. So the changing of words is what, again, part of spellings and word changes, and we're never sure what's what.
You are a Shakespearean actor and director and teacher. You've got Shakespearean training. You played a Ferengi. You were the first Ferengi on Star Trek.
One of the first four. Yes, there were four of us in that first episode, but I certainly had more lines than anybody else. Yes.
Yeah, and then eventually became Quark, who we all know and love in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, who had a great arc. But you had a lot of prosthetics and makeup to emote through. And I've heard it said, and I believe it to be true, that Shakespearean actors have an easier time of doing that than standard actors. So is that true? Is that how did your Shakespearean training help you
Well, I
be
have a thesis, and I'll start my thesis by giving you a premise. And the premise is this: almost all of the major characters in Star Trek have a classical theater background. Certainly Patrick Stewart, William Shatner, Avery Brooks, Kate Mulgrew. All of those people are and were major classical actors, supporting actors. I don't have to tell you about Rene Auberjonois, Brent Spiner, many others. In fact, most of us, most of the people who were at the top of the list as far as the cast list had classical theater background. Now, to your question about prosthetics, the thing about Shakespeare is because the language is heightened at times, not always, but at times, one needs to be a little bit larger than life, a little bit. So when the makeup artist put prosthetics on you, for an actor who's never dealt with heightened language, who's never dealt with being a little bit larger than themselves, that's going to mute their performances. The makeup is going to mute their performances. Why? Because what does an actor have to show what they're thinking, what they're feeling? Their face and their voice. So if you cover up their face, one of the two is gone. Then you only have your voice, and you have to, your specifics, as you know what I'm talking about, your specifics have to be strong enough to get what you're thinking and what you're feeling to the audience, despite the fact that you're covered in plastic. So I do think that having experience with heightened language, with classical theater, helps you get over that hurdle of the makeup that mutes your performance. It's only the eyes. In my case, it's only the eyes. For Rene as well, only the eyes. His face was totally covered. Michael Dorn, for the most part, who's not necessarily a classical actor. Not he was, he is now. Nana, who was a wonderful, incredible actress, only had the little nose, so that's not as hard. But all of us have to get you to think past what you're seeing and get you to listen to what we're saying. And there is, it's off-putting. When we had actors show up on the set for the first time, they didn't know where to look. Because looking at the makeup just was a little bit unnerving, and so they didn't know where to look. And so I imagine the audience is the same thing. Where do you look? How? Yes, the camera helps us to accept those creatures as real, but still, you have to get past the makeup to listen to what the characters are saying.
I saw the DS9 cast in 2016 in New York for the 50th anniversary thing. And the thing I remember most about that are your reactions with the late great Rene Auberjonois. You two seem to have an affinity for each other. You weren't just sort of frenemies on stage. It seemed like you were friends, or on screen rather. It seemed like you were friends off screen as well. Is that true?
That is very true. Very true. I believe the love-hate relationship that the writers developed came from their realization early on that Rene and I were bonding very quickly, and we were great friends, and we did a lot of things together. We didn't, not just Star Trek things. We traveled together, not just for conventions, but for our own enjoyment. We spent a lot of time at each other's houses. We rehearsed together. We rehearsed scenes together. We had a lot in common because we were both from the theater, and we had a lot of mutual friends. The irony is, I had done a play with Rene prior to Deep Space Nine. It's called Petrified Forest. And the truth of the matter is, I wasn't very fond of him during that production. I don't think he even knew I was alive in that production. Because we never had any scenes together, and we only passed every night once on the staircase, him going to one of his scenes, me coming back from one of my scenes. But we became great friends, and we started out, when I read the script, Odo and Quark don't like each other. Because I wasn't fond of Rene from that play, I went, oh, that'll be easy. That'll be easy. But because we became huge friends and very much involved with each other's lives, the writer saw that and incorporated that into the relationship that the two characters had. When Rene and I had a scene together, it was special. It was important, and we didn't have that many scenes together. We know that people always talk about the Odo Quark relationship and how special that was, and it was. But we would always sort of look at each other because we knew we didn't have that many scenes together.
You made me laugh a few months ago when you said that you would willingly play Quark again if you didn't have to put the makeup on. I had already seen the Lower Decks episodes that you were in, so I was like, "Oh, that's very clever. He's telling us what's happening without telling us what's happening."
Yeah.
Wordplay worthy of Shakespeare.
Thank you. I had a contract that said I could not speak about doing Lower Decks until it aired. So, and I can't tell you how many times, will we ever see you in another Star Trek iteration? And I would say what I said that you just repeated, or no, I lied to people and I felt badly about lying. But a contract, as Quark would say, a contract is a contract is a contract. And we had to keep that a secret. But I can tell you now that there are no further iterations of Star Trek for me in the future that I know of. Now, they may be writing them, but no one has talked to me about it.
Would you, if they came to you with another offer, would you be like, sure, I'll play Quark?
You know, I've been asked that question before, and I have this answer. They would have to. I can't imagine me being a series regular again. That is just a lot of work. That makeup that I've been joking about was hard to wear, and it was hot and it was claustrophobic. Not that I'd suffered from claustrophobia. It made me deaf, you know, in the sense that because of those years, I really had to look at the actors I was working with, because most of the times I couldn't hear them if I turned my head. So I would be hard pressed to say yes to a series regular existence on a show. But if a recurring character that came back frequently or infrequently, yes, I would be more than willing, eager, in fact, to do that. About 6 months before COVID hit the world, I went to England and I put on all the makeup again for the first time in decades. We had arranged for my makeup artist, Karen Westerfield, to come to England to put it on. Between the two of us, we had appliances, as they're called, from the show to have the actual pieces. She had to recolor them, as she did every day when I appeared. Everything but the teeth were original. And she was amazed. I was amazed. My wife was amazed. Ira Bear, our showrunner, was amazed how incredibly like the character of 20 years ago I appeared. It was like a time machine. I had gone back in time. There I was looking. I mean, I don't look like Snyder 20 years ago, 30 years ago anymore. But that Quark was identical to the Quark that you saw on the show. Identical. So if I were to go back, it's plausible, and Ferengi lived for a long time, they tell me. So I could go back and do it exactly the way that I did it before, or I would appear to be the same. I think I have some deeper thoughts about the character now than I did when I was doing it, but that's because time has taught me some things along the way. I've said before earlier that I played several Shakespearean plays several times. in those plays, I often play the same character again. And it is amazing to realize between the first iteration and the second iteration what has happened to me that changes the performance from that first time to the second time or the third time.
I don't know if you know this, but in Star Trek Picard, Quarks is a franchise.
So I've been told. And in Lower Decks, they also say that it's a franchise. So I'm glad that he has succeeded. I just like for him to get some more camera time. When they talk about Quark or any of the characters, but it seems to me, and I may be wrong about this, that on other shows, Quark seems to be the more mentioned character from Deep Space Nine. I am grateful for that, not only for egotistical reasons, but I am grateful for the acknowledgement of the importance of our show, which unfortunately, in the minds of the actors who were playing it at the time, we always thought we were the orphan child. We always thought that we were not considered as good as the others. And so when they mention my character or any of the other characters from our show, I see it as a way of acknowledging the importance of Deep Space Nine.
Well, it's interesting you say that because my understanding is because the network wasn't really paying as close attention to DS9 as they were to Voyager, say, you guys got to do a lot more. You got away with a lot more stuff. You were, a serialized show before Buffy was on the air.
Right. If I may correct you just a minor, you said the network. We had no network. We were not a network show. We were what you said. What your second thought is correct. We were a syndicated show that were sold to any network that wanted us, as was Next Generation. It's only Voyager that became the network show of the new network. So yes, you're absolutely right. They were interested in forming a new network, and Voyager was going to be the cornerstone of that new network. So they weren't looking at us very heavily. And they were dealing with Next Generation making films and Voyager being the cornerstone. So as I said, we felt like orphans. We felt like, well, doesn't anyone care about us? And because of that, yes, Ira and the other writers could do things under the radar because no one was paying a lot of attention, except for Berman. And I understand there were some tete-a-tetes between the writing department and Berman, and they worked out whatever compromises they needed to work out. We had enormously good writers, and they wrote us delicious things to say, and the plots are intriguing, and they took liberties that are rarely seen in Star Trek. For instance, my favorite is Far Beyond the Stars, which is an episode that has very little to do with Deep Space Nine, except it's a Deep Space Nine show. It has to deal with racism in America, and all of us, we were talking about makeup, all of us are out of makeup for most of that show. I don't think Quark ever shows up in that show. Armin does, but or Herb does. That's the character I'm playing, but not Quark. And if the characters, for the most part, do show up, it's because the lead character Benny, who is Benjamin Sisko, has a flash of seeing them as a science fiction character.
And I think that's a fan favorite episode that went under the radar when it first aired, but is now hailed as one of the best episodes of the series. It's really, really good.
It is my favorite. I would venture to say it's not only good Star Trek, it's great TV. And because the themes that the script deals with, the way Avery directed it, the performances that he got out of the actors, again, the writing, the analogies are just brilliant. I'm often asked, other actors on the show became directors. Did you ever want to be a director? And the answer I give is no, I never wanted to be a director. I did want to be a writer. And that desire to be a writer is what helped promulgate my becoming a novelist.
You've been to England. Have you ever visited Stratford or
several times. I've been to Stratford several times. In fact, right before COVID hit, my wife and I walked 105 miles from Stratford to Bath with some friends. A pathway, it's called the Cotswold Way, which I'm sure Shakespeare himself must have followed. But I have gone to Stratford, I would say 3 times, maybe 4 times, seen the plays there, visited all the tourist things that you have to do, went to visit the outlying areas, which are also part of Shakespeare's life. One, because I wanted to, because I'm a Shakespeare fan, and 2, I wanted to do it because I was going to be writing these books, the Illyria books, and I wanted to revisit things to make sure I had them right. About 4 years ago, I made a trip to London, and I was on my own. Usually my wife travels with me, but this trip I was on my own. I got to my hotel in London, and I promised myself to go someplace that I'd always wanted to go. So I looked it up. I found out how to get there by subway, and I went to Mortlake. And as you know, because you've read the books, Mortlake is the home of John Dee, the actual home of John. And I thought, I wonder if anything exists here left from John Dee. And I came to find out that there was a wall left over from the original house that sits by the Thames that is still there. And I immediately went there and stood in front of that wall. And it was a religious experience. I went, oh my God, this is the home of the guy that I've been fascinated with for 25 years. He actually lived on the other side of these bricks. All was left was the wall and the property, of course, but the view that I was seeing of the Thames had to be relatively close, not the same, of course, but relatively close to the view that he experienced when he looked out his windows.
Now, I want to wrap up with, I have a lightning round for you. What's your favorite word?
Favorite word?
Yeah.
Kitty.
What are your top 3 Shakespeare plays?
Twelfth Night, Hamlet, and ironically, Measure for Measure.
Do you have a favorite Star Trek episode?
Far Beyond the Stars.
Klingon blood wine or Cardassian Kanar?
Oh, blood wine. Kanar is horrible stuff. Horrible stuff. It's prune juice. You don't want to drink that.
Favorite Shakespearean role?
Claudius. My original from high school, Claudius.
Is there a Shakespearean role you've never played but you want to?
Yes. There's a part that I was always perfect for and never got to play. Well, I rehearsed it for 2 weeks. So the part was Richard III. And as a young man auditioning for theater in New York and in San Diego and other places, they often asked you to come in and do some Shakespearean monologue. And I always came in and did not Richard III, same character. He's Richard of Gloucester from one of the Henry VI plays, Henry VI Part 2. And I adored that character and was very good at it. That's why I got work, because I was very good. I mean, there's no 2 ways around. I'm not bragging. I went in, did that audition, they hired me. So, and I always wanted to play Richard III. And I was cast in it once. And I was in the second week of rehearsal and became enormously frustrated with the opinions of the director and just quit. So I never got actually to play it.
Armin Shimerman, thank you so much for joining me today. It has been an absolute honor.
Thank you, team. My pleasure. This was great fun.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.